Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I really have the pleasure to be here with Dr. Jasser Auda. So Dr. Jasser Auda is a globally recognized scholar. He is in Islamic law and thoughts. He is the founder and executive chairperson of the Maqasid Institute, which is a global think tank focusing on advancing Islamic scholarship, something that INCEIF also tries to do. Dr. Jasser is also a distinguished visiting professor at ISTAC IIUM. His latest contribution is a new Maqasid methodology, which touches the topic for today, that aims to bring about a restructuring of Islamic scholarship around complex network of the Maqasid of Sharia. Dr. Jasser has authored several influential books over the past couple of decades and has taught in various academic institutions worldwide. So welcome, Dr. Jasser Auda. Before we touch on the methodologies and the great work that you've been doing, I'd like for us to start with a definition of what Maqasid is and where does it fit? What is the difference when you say Maqasid as compared to fiqh, so that we know where to start? And especially that our students here, a lot of them come from economics background, law background, so they don't all have a Sharia background. Yeah, so.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's always a pleasure to be here at INCEIF, and it's always a pleasure to have a discussion with a Muslim scholar from the female side of Islamic scholarship, Dr. Eman Tabet. I am happy for that because I believe that we need to promote female Islamic scholarship. We need to promote our sisters to be part of our discussion on fiqh and usul and tafsir and hadith, and they do not lead the prayer in the masjid, but otherwise they are like us in scholarship. And our history, of course, this is not the topic of the lecture. Our history is full of chains of scholarship from أمهات المؤمنين رضي الله عنهن واذكرن ما يتلى في بيوتكن من آيات الله والحكمة, all the way to our heights of the Islamic civilization. And then we had a period where we missed the scholarship of our sisters, and alhamdulillah now it's coming back. So jazakallah khair, ahlan wa sahlan. Actually, thank you for this question, because I was concerned that people who will follow this lecture or who will come will think that I will be speaking about Maqasid Al-Shariah as in al-darurat wal-hajiyat wal-tahsiniyat, and as حفظ الدين والنفس والعقل والمال والعرض. And I have a major problem of misusing the Maqasid theory in that structure, especially when we talk about the application of Maqasid Al-Shariah to a particular discipline, a new discipline, like economics or political science or medicine or psychology. So psychology, it's the same good old Freudian psychology, or maybe you don't take a psychoanalysis kind of line and you go to Maslow or go to, I don't know, Piaget, but then you say that your psychology is compatible with Maqasid Al-Shariah. And it is Freudian psychology. It is not Maqasid based. The Maqasid comes after the theory, not before the theory. Or you define political theory based on Hobbes and Hegel and maybe a bit of Marx and so on. And after you define a Hobbesian state, you say that it's compatible with Maqasid Al-Shariah because in the Constitution it says that Maqasid Al-Shariah should be a source or any of that. And therefore, again, you are basing your politics on the Hobbesian theory, but post the Hobbesian theory, you are actually saying that it is compatible with Maqasid Al-Shariah. Similarly, if you allow me, and I know that this is a bit different from the general capitalist world we're living in today, but as Muslims, I believe that in order to contribute, we do have to understand the system and be able to critique the system. We don't have to break down the system. We don't have to cause political instability or economic instability or any of that. But we have to be able to critique the Freudian worldview of psychology and not call it Islamic psychology and claim it's compatible with Maqasid Al-Shariah. And we have to be able to critique the Hobbesian monster. In Hobbes's words, the nation state is a monster. We have to critique that monster and make sure that it doesn't eat us, and improve on the monster that they created when they created the nation state. We also have to be able to critique capitalism. I live in the West most of my life, and as someone who lived in the capitalist systems, we critique capitalism. There is, of course, until 2 years ago, things changed quite a bit. But before 2 years ago, as someone who lived in Canada and the United States and the UK and so on, there is nothing wrong in sitting in a university that teaches economics and critique capitalist systems a little bit. I don't have to bring them down. So I'm saying that we should not build Islamic economics in a way that people build Islamic psychology on Freud or Islamic political science on Hobbes and Machiavelli, and then say it is compatible with Maqasid Al-Shariah. How can Maqasid Al-Shariah be before the theory, not after the theory? It's actually, to get to your question, to understand what maqasid are. Maqsid, maqsood, maqsad is actually an objective, an intent, a why. What does Allah want, subhanahu wa ta'ala? Muradatillah, we say in Arabic, al-murad. Al-murad is your intent, your final end or objective. And the final ends of the Sharia, yes, are the protection of the basic needs and the necessities and so on. But when it comes to an application on a discipline, like economics, like psychology, like political science, again, architecture, you name it, not all of those are simply حفظ الدين والنفس والعقل والمال والأرض. This is very, very general. Of course, as a Muslim, I believe in the protection of life and the protection of progeny, and this, it's fine. But these are, in detail, the maqasid of the legislation rather than the maqasid of economics. And there is a difference between al-tashri' wal-iqtisad. If you're talking legislation and fatwa and fiqh in the traditional sense, yeah, we can talk about that. And I am someone who wrote about these things and how Maqasid Al-Shariah are linked to al-tashri' al-Islam. But when it comes to al-iqtisad, there is something that is called Maqasid al-Bab, the maqasid of the chapter. If you look at Ibn Ashur, for example, one of the great scholars of Maqasid, he talked about the Maqasid al-Mu'amalat al-Maliyah, the intents, the purposes of the financial dealings. And this specificity, like to specify al-Maqasid for the Bab, for the chapter you are talking about, that is more accurate, so that we are not apologetic, so that it's not the exact system that in any other university you will teach and learn about and so on, but then you call it maqasid. You put a abaya on it so that it looks Islamic, but it isn't. It really has major Islamic problems. If I may, what are the maqasid of al-iqtisad? If we imagine a discipline that's called economics. Again, economics is a new discipline. It's not like that. It's different from al-mal, fiqh al-mal in the past. Abu Yusuf, etc., when he talked about al-kharaj, you read a different kind of economics. He's talking about what the state could take from the people and what it gives and zakah. It's different. When you talk about iqtisad, you're talking about a new science, like when we talk about psychology or, again, international relations and political science. This is not a Jasser Auda from the past. That's very different. And it is not the adab al-nufus and tasawwuf and so on. Psychology is different. It's a science. And yes, it's a science that started not from the Islamic perspective, but then we should approach it with an Islamic lens. What are the objectives of al-iqtisad? If you are going to talk about macro or micro, if you're going to talk about the economics of a particular entity, whether the international sense, or you're going to talk about a nation state, or you are going to talk about even the human sense today. the definition of money, etc., like what you guys do when you study economics. What are the objectives of Islam? The objectives of Islam, if I may, I could put them in a few items. Let me start with that, and then the discussion would be clear. One is al-qist, or al-adl. The first maqsid, if we're going to talk about iqtisad, is actually justice. And justice is the basis of any theory that you might imagine of al-iqtisad. One is to protect the wealth. If you wish, حفظ المال. That's all right. You want to make sure that someone who has the wealth is protected. But حفظ المال is, of course, one of the 5 maqasid, but it's not the only maqsid. There is a whole bunch of other maqasid that are related to al-mal, not just حفظ المال. The first of which is إنفاق المال. One of the maqasid is to spend money versus to preserve money. That is from the first page of Surah Al-Baqarah, وَمَّا رَزَقْنَاهُمْ يُنْفِقُونَ, all the way to the end. Al-infaq, to spend money in the way of Allah, fi sabilillah, is actually one of the maqasid of the Sharia when it comes to al-iqtisad. My last visit here was maybe a year ago, 8 months ago, and I talked about al-awqaf. This whole lecture goes under that. Under al-infaq, the basic action in al-iqtisad al-Islami, from my perspective, my own fiqh of it, is actually to spend rather than to preserve. Yes, you could preserve your money and make sure that you don't fall in al-kanz. وَالَّذِينَ يَكْنِزُونَ الذَّهَبَ وَالْفِضَّةَ. That's going to be a problem if you're going to accumulate gold and silver and not spend it in the way of Allah. But if you pay its zakah and so on, the most important issue here is to spend, not just to preserve the money. And if we spend the money, am I not accumulating wealth? Is it haram? No, of course it's not haram to accumulate wealth. It's not haram to be rich in Islam, but it is haram not to spend from your wealth in the way of Allah. And therefore, the basic activity in the Islamic economics is al-awqaf, not at-tijara, not to trade. To trade is part of Islam, obviously, but to trade with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. هل أدلكم على تجارة تنجيكم من عذاب الأليم? Do I tell you about the best tijara? Is to give in the way of Allah. And when you give in the way of Allah, this is not just feeding someone hungry or giving a charity for someone to buy clothes. This is the health system is going to be based on charity, not based on the trade in people's lives, as in the pharmaceutical industries and biomedical industries and so on. That much of what it does is very important, but much of what it does is very harmful to humanity. If you're going to spend in the way of Allah, therefore, this will be the educational institutes, the schools and the universities and so on. They are supposed to be awqaf. They are not supposed to be for profit. If you're going to spend in the way of Allah, this will be obviously for the masajid and hajj and umrah and so on, ibadat, that's important too. But if you spend in the way of Allah, there is a system we had in the Islamic civilization that is called awqaf al-aswaq. So to have a waqf for a market. The market is actually a waqf. And therefore, you could enter the profession of trade without credit because you are actually having a donation money that is going to give you some ability to trade even without credit. So if I may talk about the maqasid a little bit, the first one is al-infaq fi sabilillah, to spend in the way of Allah. And the intent of that is to use modern language, to empower the society versus the monopolizers of wealth. If I may say, this is tied to another maqsid that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about in the Quran when he talked about the public money. He said, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ مَا أَفَاءَ اللَّهُ عَلَى رَسُولِهِ. And then he said, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. So that money does not circulate only amongst the rich. K is adatu ta'lil. This is a maqsid. When the Quran has a K or likay or the lam al-ta'lil, the scholars of tafsir say this is a maqsid. The circulation, they call it al-rawaj. Ibn Ashur talked about it in his book, Maqasid Al-Shariah. But al-rawaj in Islam, circulation, is not horizontally and is not up. Reagan says that money will trickle down. Money never trickles down. Money goes up all the time. And today you can see it very clearly. Since his time, money has been going up. And this is not the circulation that Islam means or intends to achieve. The circulation up here. No, the circulation should be vertical, from the rich to the poor, and from the poor to the rich. And that vertical circulation closes, if you wish, the gap, to use modern term, the gap between the rich and the poor should be there in Islam. This is how Allah created the universe, rich and poor, strong and weak, powerful and powerless. That's normal. What's not normal is for money not to circulate vertically from the rich to the poor and so on, so that the poor become poorer and the rich become richer. That is not Islamic. That goes against the maqsood of Islam. Islam is not intending for the economic reality to be like that. And the gap between the 1% club and then the 10% club, if you wish, and then the rest of humanity is now a major gap. And that is not capitalism or left thinking or any of that. I don't come from this perspective. That is a problem because it goes against the maqsood of the circulation of money. The circulation of money should be upwards and vertical. The justice is also tied to man'u ribba, is to avoid ribba. And ribba is a big deal in Islam. Ribba is not equal to interest. Interest is part of ribba, or could be part of ribba, if you want to get into that really very precisely. But ribba is to create money from nothing, is dinarun bidinarain. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, you give him 1 dinar and he gives you 2 dinar, that is ribba. Why? Because that second dinar, it's created from nothing. You did not trade in it. It's just money increasing. And let me give you also an opinion of mine, and it's also totally up to you to think about it. I understand this is a group of professors and graduate students and all of that, and therefore it's a discussion. If the second dinar is going to be haram, then if you create 2 dinars out of nothing, it's also haram, it's also riba. I write about it these days, and I call it ربا استحداث المال من العدم. استحداث المال من العدم is to create money, literally, from nowhere. They call it in the Latin language fiat, and of course you know that very well. And that is a form of riba, because you are creating a value just like that, and not only that, and that value is actually going down. Based on what? Based on the system, based on the cycle that you all know very well, that this value that's created is going to be lent to the more powerful and people with the higher credits. And then by the time it trickles down to the banks and then to the customers and back to the banks, including Islamic banks, is going to actually create 9 folds or 10 folds of that wealth, 8 folds, 8.1, depending on the country, but in the range of 8 to 10 times. And then that creation is going to actually decrease the value of the money you have in your pocket for everyone in the world. So Obama got stuck with, they say $100 trillion so he created $100 trillion and he solved his problem. Where did he get that money from? From everyone who has $1 in his pocket, which is everyone in the world. Before last month, that hopefully this will change. But then because we all have dollars in our pocket or our oil or our, you name it, therefore we are doing what's called bakhs. وَلَا تَبْخَسُوا النَّاسَ أَشْيَاءَهُمْ means that when you give, don't give a value less than the value due. That is called bakhs. And it is a maqsood of the Sharia not to have bakhs, I don't owe you 100 and then I give you 80 or 90. That is called bakhs. I am taking down, not up, Ribba, I'm doing bakhs, which is the opposite of riba. Both are haram and both are not allowed in Islam. And it doesn't mean that we, again, break the system, as I said in the beginning, for those who just came in. It doesn't mean to break the system, but we should be able to critique the current systems from the Islamic perspective. And we should be able to start to think, can we have a step forward? Can we have less riba than the current riba in the system? Can we avoid the ihtikar or the monopoly this way? Not just the monopoly of goods and camels, at the doors of Medina. That is ihtikar, but that's not the only form of ihtikar. The ihtikar al-mal, or the monopoly over money itself, is actually ihtikar, is a problem.
Let's build on that because you gave us a lot to think about. So I think the first thing is like, how do we operationalize? Because one part that you mentioned is that we need to sit there and look at all the new fields of knowledge that we have within our field, Islamic finance and economics. Like we need to sit and think, okay, what are the Maqasid of Sharia that are within this? And we do talk about rawaj, and that's directly or indirectly links to preservation of wealth or mal, but it's not limited to that. And you went, you mentioned all those other maqasid that are within our field of study. Now the question for us, like once we operationalize, you did mention like we need to critique, right? But a lot of times also what happens, there's recently, like we've been talking a lot about sustainability and all that, and then we reach the point where a lot of people say, oh, we have a sustainability fatigue. It's like we're tired of hearing the word. And it's really saddens me that we reach the point where we also hear the word, we are maqasid fatigue. Which is it's a very sad and unfortunate point to reach at. And I don't know where did we reach here? I think a lot of times we try to operationalize maqasid within our research, within, what can we do as an industry? So I think the question is like, what are the challenges that we are facing in operationalizing maqasid? Because what is the steps? It's like we critique what's happening in Islamic bank or in our economy and say, how can we make it less riba, as you mentioned, right? Like less how do we step away from this? What are the steps that we can take within that? So I'm like trying to zoom into the parts that you mentioned in operationalizing those maqasid.
Well, Jazakallah khair, I think that we need to redefine the objectives from the industry. What is the industry for? Is it for enlarging wealth? Is it for money, generating money? If it is for trading in money this way, then it is doing very well. There is nothing wrong with it because it's achieving its objectives. But if the industry of Islamic economics and Islamic financing is achieving the Islamic goals from economics or financing, then we need to make changes. And these changes cannot be apologetic in the sense of the same thing, the same monopoly, but then we call it maqasid oriented or maqasid compliant or any of that. And therefore, how to operationalize? Step one is to redefine our goals, is to ask ourselves, if we are in the business of creating money from money, then that's what we do. But if we are in the business of other things, including trade, the real trade, وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَى, like the real bay'ah, is to actually get into trading, farming, industry. You take the risk and you don't take your money before the customer leaves the bank. Whether you call yourself Islamic bank or not, you take the money before he leaves, and 100 for 120, that is riba. With all due respect. But in order to operationalize, one is to redefine our objectives. And when you redefine the objective, then this is going to impact how much murabaha you do, for example, versus how much qirad or mudaraba. At least we start with that. Let alone tawarruq. Like we really need to go zero on tawarruq, in my perspective. And then we try to minimize the murabaha until we really let it fade away, even though it is now, according to your research, like people in your field, 90% plus 92, 94% of what we do in the Islamic finances world. And therefore, this is trading in money. We need to decrease that as much as we can, That's operationalizing. The 5-7% other than murabaha, that has to do with qirad or mudaraba, or basically taking the risk in order to do tijara, bay', normal. وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا. To enlarge that and to increase that. And this will mean less return, and this will mean that money is not going to grow in the same way. But we are talking about the Islamic paradigm, if we really want to do that. The other thing is to work on our ummah politically. And this is part of the operationalization of the Islamic economics. Without our ummah defending itself politically and militarily from its enemies, it is not possible to build a more just system, a more fair system, a more system that has less riba. Part of what's happening in Palestine, I know this is not a political lecture, but part of what's happening in Palestine, to me, is actually a struggle between the forces of capitalism in that very vicious way and the forces of the voice of the people. This is not only about liberation of a people on their land, it is also about a system of monopoly on the capitalist worldview in the capitalist sense that is actually trying to be even more vicious and try to accumulate the wealth up instead of the top 10% all the way to the top 1%. That's how I see it too. And therefore, how to operationalize is actually to support those in our ummah who are trying to challenge the paradigm, the international political paradigm that is keeping these kinds of status quos. And that's not just in Palestine, but in many other parts, especially of the Muslim world, where people are fighting for justice. People are trying to uprise, and then governments crack down on them, and then back, and so on. I see all of this within our ummah trying to stand on its feet and trying to have its own economics and trying to plant its own food and have industry for its own oil and gas and all of that. This is not separate from what's happening in the areas where there are wars and struggles in our ummah. So that's another way of operationalizing. The very, very local way is actually, it starts with education. That's why I'm very happy also always to receive an invitation from an education institute like yours, and especially elite, if I may say, institute, and institutes that create leaders in the industry, like your institute. Because if you are a leader in the industry, then perhaps you can start to change some of the issues. Islam is not asking you to be poor or asking your customers to be poor, any of that, but it has a system for being rich and being poor. And not like that, not like what we see today, where the poor are hungry and shelterless, and this is not Islamic. Whether in a Muslim majority or non-Muslim majority society, it is not right for a society to have people who have a problem to eat food. That is not the Islamic paradigm. And this is not poverty, this is injustice. Once the poor is poor is not injustice. But the poor is hungry is actually injustice, dhulm in Islam. Why? Because it is the responsibility of the rich. It is not out of their good heart. It is their haqq. وآتي ذا القربى حقه والمسكين. That miskin has a haqq. Haqq is a right. And in modern states, we translate the word right into a law. We should have a law that says the rich cannot allow the poor to be hungry and be shelterless and to die over a pill for a $1 or $2 because they don't have $1 to buy their pills and they die, or they don't have a vaccine in a time of pandemics or any of that. That is not Islamic. And that is supposed to be part of our operationalization of the Maqasid. But because we looked at the Maqasid from the other end, we looked at the Maqasid post the system, not pre the system, we don't see that. We don't see that we have some problems that we need to deal with. And we think everything is nice and dandy, as we say in America, because everything is just fine. Like, alhamdulillah, حفظ الدين والنفس والعقل والمال والعرض. You know, this bank, does it do حفظ الدين? Yeah. Does it do حفظ العرض? Yeah, of course. حفظ النفس. Yeah. And then we click on these because the I don't know, whatever the institution is, that is not a fair institution, is actually having some good impact on life and progeny. And yeah, sure. Any system will have a good impact. But how is the system built? What is the philosophy of economics? This is very important. And when you teach methodology, perhaps then we can talk about the topic of the lecture. It is important that methodology becomes philosophy, not just how to do surveys and questionnaires and so on. When I used to be a professor, now I consider myself to be retired. When I used to be a professor and I teach methodology, I taught two types of methodology courses. One is actually how to do interviews and questionnaires and the representation of data and some stats, and you use some software to do some statistics. And the other more serious courses of methodology that I taught or was part of or I witnessed in some really advanced universities is philosophy. So when you are in a policy school and you take a methodology course, I gave a lecture once in Princeton University in the United States in their methodology course, in their policy school. So I talked to them about philosophy, the philosophy of policy. Because methodology is not just questionnaire and interviews. That is very, very shallow. That's methodology for high schoolers. But methodology for graduate studies is the philosophy. When they teach methodology in Harvard or Oxford or any of these universities, Cambridge, at some point I was affiliated with, you teach philosophy. You are in the political science department, you are going to teach Hobbes and Marx and Hegel and this and compare and postmodernists. You are in the arts school, you are going to teach the philosophy of arts. You are in the psychology school, you're going to teach the philosophy of the human psychology. You are not going to teach. So sometimes when we teach Islamic economics or Islamic psychology or Islamic law for that matter, we don't get into the philosophy of it, the basis, the theories, the basic theories of the science. And that course is going to actually make you critical about what you are doing. You take political theory, what's called political theory, political science, then yes, you are a politician or a political scientist, but you understand that the state is actually a myth. It's a good myth, perhaps, bid'ah hasana, if I may say. You know, it's a good myth, it helps in some issues, but it has some problems. Because you are a true political scientist, you understand that the state is not something Allah created subhanahu wa ta'ala naturally. It's something we invented. Similarly, if you are a good Islamic economist, you know that the bank is a myth too. Yes, it is good and it might cause good stuff and it's necessary because of 1, 2, 3, 4, but it also has problems, 1, 2, 3, 4. And how can, as Muslims, minimize the problems and maximize the benefits? From the Islamic point of view, with our Islamic glasses on, we are not like the atheist, other researcher, who just wants to increase the dunya. This is not our goal. We have higher goals in the dunya, and we have goals in the akhirah too. And therefore, even if I'm not convinced that riba is riba, I'm not supposed to do riba, you see, and so on. And therefore, we are not going to argue with riba as they argued, what's his name, for usury or for the sake of usury, what's his name, the economist who argued for usury. Some economists argue for the benefit of usury, and that usury is exactly like buying and selling, because he defined وأحل الله البيع وحرم ذلك بأنهم قالوا إنما البيع مثل الربا. That's exactly what the Quran talked about. وأحل الله البيع وحرم الربا. And therefore they say, you put a price, oh, you put an interest. It's the same thing. You have to be able to critique that operationally.
Thank you so much for that. Now, yeah, to get into the methodology parts, and I think this is something you speak about a lot. And you have talking about a new approach to the methodology of Maqasid. So if you can elaborate on that approach, and what are the principles? How is it based? How do we,
MashaAllah. I wrote a whole book on that, published maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I'm writing something else these days, but I can send that book to whomever asks for the book, here or online. I have it there, and it doesn't have these restrictions. I called it Re-envisioning Islamic Scholarship, Maqasid Methodology as a New Approach, in which I'm trying to centralize Maqasid, not in the 5 and 3 levels and all of that sense, in the wider sense that I talked about since we started today, and especially what you can put under Maqasid al-Quran, because Maqasid al-Quran are much wider than Maqasid Al-Shariah. And Maqasid Al-Shariah are part of Maqasid al-Quran, of course. This part of what the Quran intends to do to protect lives and to protect progeny and wealth, but it's also, as I mentioned, to spend from the wealth and to spend from the lives and many other maqasid. And therefore, the methodology that I put in a number of steps just for the sake of researchers and all of that, I wrote like 300-400 pages on that, but I can summarize. Inshallah, I can send you if you are interested. One is to define a purpose of your research. Why research? Because research has to come before education, and education has to come before action. Before we change the reality of institutions, we have to change the reality of education. And before changing the reality of education, we have to do research from an Islamic point of view. And that research has to start not with a problem statement, but rather with a purpose statement. I know my students suffer from that. I still supervise a few graduate students, and they suffer because I tell them, you are not allowed to define a problem. You need to define a purpose. Why? Because they define the wrong problem, because they don't have a framework. They don't have a philosophy that they come from, and therefore they want to write about the fiqh of women in Islam. Their problem is patriarchy. But patriarchy is not an Islamic concept. It has some against Islam, it has some with Islam, actually. And it would not be right. What is it? Oh, it's the authority of men. Well, who said that men don't have authority in Islam? It doesn't mean that women don't have authority too, but it's not an Islamic concept. They talk about social justice, for example. They want to write a PhD in social justice or justice. They start from a premise of equality, for example. But equality is not a Quranic concept. There is nowhere in the Quran that everyone is equal. And yes, the Nabi ﷺ said, nobody is better than nobody, except with taqwa. So you could be better than me, we're not equal if you have more taqwa. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. Men have care, have responsibility, al-qawama, I would say responsibility over women, not because men are better than women. The ayah did not say that. He did not say بما فضل الله الرجال على النساء. He said بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض. Some men are better than some women, and some women are better than some men. And some of the responsibilities of men are actually higher than the responsibilities of women. And some of the responsibilities of women are higher than the responsibility of men. As someone works in the family law, when there is a divorce, Allah forbid, we give the small children to the woman. Is she because she's better than the man? Yes, she is, in taking care of the infants. It's not that the Islamic law is against men, it's because she is responsible for them. And therefore, she should have authority over their hidana or custody because she is responsible. And because he is responsible for the nafaqa, what is called the sustenance or the support of the family, therefore he has authority over what's called the wilaya, for example. Why? Because he has a responsibility, therefore he has authority. The concept of men and women are equal in a society is not an Islamic concept. And therefore, if you come from the problem statement perspective, a problem statement of development or sustainability for that matter, and I tell the student, what do you mean by development? Which theory of development? That's very important. One of my students was working on economic development, and especially, what was that again? Economic freedom. So she took the economic freedom index and she wants to make these Islamic objectives. I said, no, these are not Islamic objectives. These are objectives for the markets. Like, you know, the intellectual property and registering patents in the United States. It's nothing in Islam has to do with this. This is injustice, actually. But you are taking the economic freedom index and you want to make this Maqasid Al-Shariah. No, that's not Maqasid Al-Shariah. So we have to start with the purpose, not the problem statement, because the problem statement, if it does not come from the right framework, it will have the wrong problem defined rather than the right problem. Second step, and there are 5 steps, second step is what I call cycles of reflection in the Quran and Sunnah. Therefore, you read the Quran with your purpose in mind. My purpose, for example, economically, is to alleviate poverty, for example, to solve the poverty problem in the society, for equity and fairness in trade, for, like, there is a maqsid that is compatible with the Maqasid Al-Shariah, real Maqasid Al-Shariah. And you're trying to read the Quran in order to see what is the Quran telling us about my purpose, about my maqsid. How can I achieve my maqsid? And of course, the Sunnah of the Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam revolving around the Quran. I talked a lot about the difference between Hadith and Sunnah and the difference between the Sunnah and the Quran. And like, there are lots of technical details there. It's not just simple. But how can you have cycles of reflection in the Book of Allah? As a researcher doing your PhD, you have 3 or 4 years, read the Book of Allah at least once with your research in mind and heart. You cannot just do your research and then all your references are non-Muslims, with all due respect, who don't come from the Islamic perspective, and you are writing a thesis and having a degree on Islamic economics. And everyone you are citing, except for very, very few archaic things from the past, that you are citing this Imam or that Imam, that do not belong to today. We don't deal the same way today. We don't have the same money, we don't have the same market, we don't have the same definition of monopoly. In fact, we need to upgrade the definition of monopoly from the capitalist definition to our definition of monopoly as Muslims, etc. So Quran and Sunnah would be step number 3. Step number 3 is to build a framework, for which I suggested 7 elements. These 7 elements, when you read the Quran and the Sunnah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and you look for, you are going to start to have a different worldview that allows you to research your topic from an Islamic point of view. 1, al-Maqasid, or the purposes, to look for Maqasid al-Quran in that sense, very, very wide lens. 2, al-Mafahim, the concepts. What is the concept of tijara in Islam? What is the concept of mal? What is the concept of Ribba? What is the concept? The concepts. And you build your conceptual framework based on Islamic terms. If there are non-Islamic terms in your thesis, they have to be judged by the Islamic terms. So you're going to talk free markets. That's not an Islamic term. Then take the Islamic terms and then look at free markets, pros and cons from the Islamic point of view. Otherwise, you have the wrong conceptual framework. So 2, to build a conceptual framework. 3, to build the parties framework, the groups. The Quran is grouping people according to different categories, according to different concepts as well. So how to translate the concepts into groups or parties. 4th, universal laws, or Sunan al-Ilahiyya. And I talked a lot in that book about how to read the Book of Allah, looking for a Sunan Ilahiyya. Sunan al-Adl, al-Tadawul, al-Tadafu'. You know, there are many Sunan, and there is a long story about that. But basically, the higher purposes, the higher laws that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created the universe with. And 1, al-Awamir wa-Nawahi, the commands. The commands have to be part of your framework, but the commands are not the only part. Because if you have the right commands, but not the right concepts, you are going to do riba because you did not define riba. Because you take the command without critiquing the concept. And therefore, I linked the commands with the concepts and the parties and the universal laws and Maqasid Al-Fahim wal-Fi'at wal-Sunan wal-Qiyam, values as well. I wrote quite a bit on three types of values. The values of beauty, al-jamal, and values of morality, al-akhlaq, and values of al-nafa' or manafi' or masalih. Al-masalih is not the only value in Islam, what you can gain materially, but what you can gain has to be khuluq, has to be within the ethical, moral framework of Islam, and has to be from al-jamal. It has to also be beautiful, or al-husn. The concept of husn in Islam is a Shari'i concept. It's not just an aesthetic concept. That's Greek. But in Islam, everything has to be beautiful, has to be hasan in that sense. And it's not necessarily equal to the Mu'tazila, tahsin wa taqbih, but it has some resemblances there in that part of, and so on. So when you build a framework, and al-hujaj, or the logical arguments, and I detail, and therefore, step number 4 is to have a comparative study between the Islamic approach and non-Islamic approach. That is when you start to quote other people. You cannot start to quote other people from the problem statement. Otherwise, there is a problem. But you have to do your purpose statement, and then reflection on the Quran and Sunnah, and then you build a framework, the conceptual and the purpose framework, and then you compare the Islamic ideas with the non-Islamic ideas. And then step number 5, finally, you have to come up with the guiding principles or the formative theories. So in order to guide your thesis, your research, you have to come up with principles. And these principles are going to guide the way you translate your research into institutional policy or into fatwas if you're into the area of fiqh or any of that. Al-qawa'id, what's called in fiqh al-qawa'id. And it's very important to have al-qawa'id in place so that the ahkam do not go against the qawa'id. We have that in fiqh. It's very important in economics too, to have economic principles from the Islamic point of view so that your opinions on the issues do not contradict the principles of Islamic economics. So these are the 5 steps and the 7 elements of the framework and so on. So that's, and I'm more than happy to discuss that perhaps.
Just within that, so those five steps, do you think, anyone who's approaching a research that not necessarily have a background in Sharia can adopt and leverage them? Or what are the kind of points that students need to keep in mind, those who are not well-versed in Sharia or starting off?
Yeah, I have a problem with the colonial definition of Sharia, with all due respect. The colonialists realized that in order for the Ummah to surrender, they had to sever the tie between Sharia and life. And therefore, they did not want our life as Muslims. Colonials, everybody, from how did it start? The Western Empire, the Portuguese at the beginning, the Spanish with the Inquisition, and then the Portuguese, and then, mashallah, everyone, the English and the French and the Italians in North Africa, and then we had the Russians occupying major parts of Islam. I'm talking about the whole colonialist kind of empire over the past 7-8 centuries that attacked the Muslim world. They wanted us as nations not to have a relation between Islam and life. And therefore, you live as a Muslim in your mosque only. Why? Because that's how they imagine Christianity, or that's how they redefined Christianity post the Renaissance, that you are going to live Christianity in the church. Outside the church, you have nothing to do with Christianity. You are just a person. You are a citizen. You are whatever, a customer, a consumer, however they define the person. And we refused. And we said, then what? We have something called marriage and we have something called zina. They said, okay, we'll give you marriage and zina. Okay, take the mahkama shar'iyya, take the court, and when you marry in the court. Fine. And you have the Islamic code for marriage. And then we said inheritance. Okay, fine. And the inheritance. And this. But economics, no, that's not Islam. Politics, no. Lawmaking, architecture, you want to talk psychology, you want to do engineering, you want to manufacture, you want to, no. This has nothing to do with Islam. And therefore, the Sharia, instead of being about everything, And fiqh, Sharia is the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. What we understand is called fiqh. It's not called Sharia, yani just to be more accurate. Fiqh is about everything. And in our history, everything was fiqh. The books of medicine, read Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina and what's called the Fuqaha Qartaj. Fuqaha in Qartaj, they had hospitals. The doctors were called Fuqaha. They wrote stuff. That is called fiqh. Fiqh al-tib, the fiqh of medicine. They studied animals and so on, zoology. Read Al-Jahir, for example. His book Al-Hayawan, the animals. In the beginning of the book, he said, this is a book on fiqh. هذا كتاب في التفقه. It's book. It's zoology. It's a zoology book, but it's fiqh. When they studied optics and they calculated the circumference of the earth and the sun and the galaxies, they did that in the Middle Ages of Islam. They called it fiqh too. When they studied architecture, fiqh al-amara, we had books of that, the fiqh of architecture. Why? Because architecture in Islam is not just to have a dome and to write on the wall. Architecture has a philosophy and has an approach that is different from the French approach that is now the usual approach. And fiqh al-siyasa shar'iyya. When you do politics, you have to study fiqh al-siyasa. And when you do economics, fiqh al-mal, you study the fiqh of. So when you tell me, my sister, that I don't have a background in Sharia and therefore how can I do economics? No, you are the faqih of economics. But you need to develop that science so that you become a faqih. I am someone who studied law and maybe specialized as a lawyer and so on in family law. And therefore I don't understand economics. You are not supposed to ask me what is halal, what's haram in economics. I'm supposed to ask you because you are the faqih of economics and I am a faqih of family law. I can give you fatwa on the inheritance and divorce, Allah forbid, and custody. I'm an expert in that. But I haven't studied economics and I haven't studied architecture. So if one of you is an architect, some of our students in ISTAC are architects, and they come and tell me, how to develop. I tell them, you tell me, you are the architect. I didn't study architecture. I'm a lawyer. I don't know what you're talking about. But I can supervise you so that perhaps you can start to ask, what is Islamic architecture? How can we do Islamic architecture today? We don't have to necessarily copy from Sinan or copy from the past. We don't have to necessarily. But there is a concept for architecture, the theory. So when you tell me that because we don't have a background in Sharia, we cannot approach economics, I think there is a double problem here. One problem is that we're asking the fuqaha to tell us about Sharia, to tell us about economics, but they are not trained in economics. I sit on, as my sister mentioned, some fiqh councils, the European Council, the North American Council. I'm advising a number of other councils with the Indian Council at some point, etc. So I sit in a fiqh session to discuss an economic issue. Recently, blockchains and digital currency and all of that. And we don't understand this stuff, but we're giving fatwas. It's haram, it's halal. And then when we bring an economist to discuss with us, the economist doesn't have the Islamic background sometimes, so it becomes a problem. Or the economist has the right background, and therefore, he's the one who should give the fatwa, not us. We can give the fatwa on the stuff that we studied, but because I don't understand the whole technology of digital currency, and I understand everything is digital currency now, even the dollar. I don't know, everything is digital. But that's what I said. They told me, well, you don't understand economics. Okay, fine, maybe I don't. So I am calling for our brothers and sisters who are economists, who are actually in an Islamic university, to develop themselves as fuqaha of economics, so that they become the reference for the fuqaha, and not to come to us, people who sit on those majalis al-fatwa, who are not specialized in economics. I'm sure in Malaysia, there are people who gather both economics and fiqh. But I'm talking about our reality in the West, because I'm on these majalis, not here. In the majlis al-fatwa in the West, we don't have people who are specialized in both. And therefore, we suffer from that. But develop here yourselves as fuqaha of the economics. And therefore, how to become a faqih? You don't have to necessarily become an expert in family law, and you're not qualified to give fatwa in the family law, but you have to be familiar with the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, This is the basic fiqh of anything. And familiarize from yourself with the Quran and Sunnah from the economic perspective. So if you are an economist, you don't have to familiarize yourself in the Quran and Sunnah from the historical perspective or the linguistic perspective. You don't know Arabic, it's fine. But you should be able to read with an economic lens so that you familiarize yourself. I have met scholars of Islam who don't know Arabic, but they are specialized in biology, for example. And they read the Quran and the Sunnah with biological eyes, not according to the miracles and so on. That's a different debate. I'm talking about taking an Islamic approach to biology, to creatures, to the study of animals and plants. And there is an Islamic approach. We consider them to be nations like us with languages. And for example, the secular science does not consider the languages to be languages to start with, and does not consider their families to be families. But you see, so develop yourselves as fuqaha of economics, and then I will come and ask you, not the other way around, because you're the expert. Inshallah.
Thank you. I think it ultimately goes back to the point that you mentioned earlier in terms of we need to redefine and critically look at each field of knowledge that is beyond just the 5 necessities that we usually define and confine Maqasid Al-Shariah in. Now, in terms of applying this methodology, and in our research, for example, like some of the research we work on at INCEIF, with the industry. So the industry is starting to move towards wanting to apply Maqasid. And of course, the industry is all about the numbers and very quantitatively driven. So one of the main things that have been assigned to us is quantifying Maqasid Al-Shariah, or tell us, okay, as an Islamic bank, what is the percentage of our compliance with Maqasid? What is how, it's if there is a ceiling, how far are we from there? And so that is something that we have been working on in terms of how do you define the ceiling first, which is in defining the Maqasid and the objectives, and is it something that is like a ceiling, is there a number to it that we can then reach and measure? So that is something that we continuously work on. So I want your input on that. Do you think, is it quantifiable, first of all? Can we define that, okay, this maqsad for our university or in the market or for an Islamic bank, this is the maqsad, and you are 70% there. And what does that mean?
Yeah, well, I don't know. As someone who lived in North America for a long time, this quantification business is very American. It's so American, for God's sake. And you can see where the American culture is now because of this quantification business. It's changed quite a bit. First time I got introduced to the American culture was 40 years ago when I immigrated to that part of the world. And they were not like that. I mean, over the decades, everything now is about numbers. Everything is about the first and the second and the 70% and 25%. And I find a problem in that because they often, in the popular culture, they often measure the wrong things. Who cares? The first, I don't know, female to drop a ball in the basket from 20, who cares about, what is the significance of that? But it's how empires, disintegrate. That aside, I could answer your question perhaps in terms of the hands-on here. I think you can quantify the maqasid, absolutely, and try to reach the goal that you quantified. But my advice is to choose the right maqasid, and not to choose the maqasid superficially. As I mentioned, it's the same economic freedom index, again, to use that example, but we're going to quantify it, and we're trying to reach the economic freedom goals. But the economic freedom goals are not necessarily Islamic, and some of them are highly problematic. So critique the economic freedom goals, or critique the SDGs, or critique anything that is not coming from the Islamic perspective. And then after you critique that, you say, okay, I'm going to define a number and perhaps try to reach that number. That is noble and that is fine. I have a problem with the numberization of life like that, but It's good if you have the right goals. So I'm going to break the record of that number because that number means something. You know, let's try to minimize poverty and let's take it from 30% to 20%. That's good. That's why not, I guess. Even though the numberization, as I mentioned, has quite problematic. You know, in Islam, many is not necessarily good. And the majority is not an indication of truth. You know, in Islam, in fact, the majority is indication of falsehood. You know, the Quran is full of that. The Quran is telling you that most people will not understand and will not believe. And the majority of humanity is not guided. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a wisdom so that the guided ones and the ones who are going to do jihad for the sake of Allah in every sense are going to be the minority of the minority. This is the nature of Islam. And therefore, sometimes there is a problem with mentioning the majority numbers. I am going to make sure that 80% of the people are satisfied. But they could be satisfied for the wrong reasons. And it is probably the case. If you have 80% satisfaction with anything, it's probably the wrong thing and the wrong policy and the wrong. This is not a measure of truth. And I know that democracies use the majority in order to alternate power. And I think it's a genius way to alternate power instead of blood. And we have a problem, like I come originally from the Arab world, we have a problem of alternation of power. You know, I was born in Egypt, and Egypt did not have a peaceful alternation of power for 10,000 years now. 10,000 years, the pharaoh has to be killed or has to be removed. 10,000 years, not just the past few years. And therefore, you want to have a majority of people choosing a president or a king or you name it. Fine, choose a king based on a majority. You solve a bit. But the majority is not a measure of truth if you're going to be a researcher, because they choose sometimes the wrong person. Yeah, fine. They choose the wrong person, like we see in the West these days. But at least they don't kill each other over it. So it's good. It's better for the society. It's the wrong person, and they bring someone from the bottom of the society and they make him king. Fine. Yeah, you know, even though he does not represent the society. I am someone who lives in America, for example, and in Canada and the West. We don't have the best people as our politicians, really. You know, there are much more better people in Germany or in America that could lead these countries. But at least democracy makes sure that we are peaceful. You know, we don't kill each other yet within these societies. But in your research, fiqh is not a democratic practice. And I fail the students who come and say, okay, 3 out of 4 madhahib said this. No, that's wrong. Who said that 3 out of 4 madhahib means truth? The 3 might be wrong, and the madhab that takes the only opinion might be right. And even outside the 4 madhab, and Wallah ibn Taymiyyah said something, or Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam might be right for today, for the fatwa, you see. And the 4 madhab were wrong. For today, at least. It's not a measure of. So, very long answer, but I apologize.
Thank you. Important points. I'd like to open the floor for our audience. I think we gave them quite a bit of fruits for thoughts. But before we open the floor for the questions, my last question would be for the sake of our students here, because all of our students are masters and PhDs. They all need to do research. So I'd like to end with, my last question for you would be, are there any topics of research that would be worthwhile for students who are interested to take on board that touch on the maqasid or the methodological issues or anything that can come to your mind that we need to answer this question or purpose of research, as you mentioned earlier? That's what you tell your students that they need to pursue.
Well, if I may, of course, you are the experts. Yeah, you have professors here, and you are the experts. But from my perspective, I think it would be very good if you take social phenomena that have an economic side or an economic impact, and ask your students to be part of the solution of these social phenomena. Poverty, racism, violence, like unjustified violence, obviously, discord in the society, problems in the society that are considered social problems, not necessarily economic problems. And then try to bring them to the field of economics, because economics is a great tool and it could really change people's lives. So if you can focus on social problems, I would think that this would be a good idea, inshallah.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll open the floor for questions and answer.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa
Wa alaikum
barakatuh.
assalam.
Thank you very much for very insightful in the thoughts, which requires us to look at the economy from the foundation, from the fundamental perspective. So I would like to know your suggestions in terms of for the young researchers who are doing research in different fields. And whenever they do research, they come up, they kind of came across with the information. And information has its own psychological effect to the person. So maybe they will find out something wrong in the system. So that what would you suggest to the students who are doing a research and not to lose their objectivity by going emotional in terms of doing a research, so that emotional aspect of it shouldn't affect the outcome of the research?
Barakallahu feekum. I wouldn't be able to answer a question because I think emotions are fine. They are just, we are emotional creatures. Emotions versus objectivity is not an Islamic parity. I don't believe in that. I don't believe in objectivity. I don't think there is any objectivity without an element of subjectivity. And there is no subjectivity without an element of objectivity. And the objective truth, to me, is defined in a material world. That's the definition of, laicite, or what we call secularism. And that's, the definition of objective truth as in something that can be measured. This is not the Islamic paradigm. Yes, you can have emotions. Sometimes when I do research, I get very angry at injustice. I get fuming and I want to, break the computer because of the injustice I'm reading. And sometimes when I do research, I get very happy to see something truthful or something for the sake of Allah or something charitable. And as a researcher, I don't advise you to separate yourself from your emotions. Emotions are part of you as a Muslim. But you should have the guided emotions. You should not be happy about something wrong. And you should not be angry about something wrong. It's normal to be happy, to be angry, to have emotions. I don't know, and it's normal to try to critique the myth, if I may say, with all due respect, the myth of objectivity in economic equations. This is I did not study economics in any formal way, but when I took a couple courses back in Canada, I said, how is this truth? Why? Who said that? But you should be able to critique a little bit. As a student, you read something and they tell you, well, this goes up, this goes down. Why? Maybe not, you see. So try to be critical a little bit about objective truths because oftentimes they're not. They are myths. And if you are going to write a thesis, therefore you are going to be an expert in something, you should be able to realize the myth from truth in the expertise that you are developing, inshallah. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, Prof. So it's so good to see you again. I'm very glad that you are now professor attached to ISTAT because I'm also from UAE. I'm also now I'm a part-time lecturer from a private university. I'm doing my PhD in UAE. So I have attended a lot of your programs and I'm really grateful that I learned a lot from you. I have two questions to clarify my mind. First of all, it is about maybe from my lack of knowing about different kind of methods from different kind of regions in this globe, right? So we have from the Middle East school as example, maybe it's from my own lack of experience knowing their own schools, like from the Jordanian perhaps, or perhaps from Saudi. Because we have lack of interaction from Malaysia with them. Maybe they have their own school. So my question is, how's your way of doing this is different from their own way of doing Islamic economics? That's my first question. My second question is on the approach of Dawa, for example. From the perspective of Dawa, they believe that in order to do changes or in order to do something good from Islamic perspective, it needs a gradual kind of, changes, right? So if I approach, as example, a big company or even a small company that they have to do this and they have to do that, they may be unwilling to accept my idea because they feel reluctant and perhaps they are not ready to accept the idea. So from the perspective of Dawah, how do you look from that perspective? And maybe is it important that you think need to be also included in when we're trying to spread the idea of Islamic economics? Yeah.
Barakallahu feekum. I think when you talk about Islamic economics and you talk about schools, you should not divide the Islamic schools by country. Like you mentioned, Jordan, like these are modern countries. They didn't exist 50 years ago. This is just, a French guy and a British guy sat about 100 years ago and they put lines on the map of the Arab world. And therefore, yeah, fine, these are the current states and we respect them and we have to go in and out and abiding by their laws, but they are not Islamic schools. They are just nation states. You see, they represent particular nations. Supposedly, every one of those lines contain a nation, they say, the French and the British said. So, but the Islamic schools have to be divided according to what's called al-madahib al-fiqhiyya in the past. But in the present, they are not exactly like that. Yes, we still have, of course, Shafi'iyya and Ahnaf and Malikiyya and Ja'fariyya and Zaydiyya, Ibadiyya, etc., and so forth. But they don't necessarily, like within the Shafi'iyya and within the Ahnaf and within the Ja'fariyya, there are trends. So I advise you to look at the new trends. The school that's called itself Al-Wasatiyya school. There is a school, I don't necessarily subscribe to it, that calls itself Al-Maqasidiyya, the Maqasid school, the Wasati school, the Islamization of knowledge school. Wallahi, the Sahwa school, and so on, ulama al-Sahwa, and so forth. There are different schools, so look at the modern schools, but not necessarily in the nation state, the political sense, because this is different. How to do da'wah is to be gradual. Yes, you could tell the company, do this and not do that. They tell you, well, this doesn't make any sense. But try to appeal to them. If you are talking about a social issue, for example, bring it through the social responsibility window. For example, many companies are willing to listen to that. They are not willing to compromise their profits, but you can tell them, well, you have a social responsibility. And therefore, in terms of da'wah, as you're mentioning, you're entering in their system an Islamic concept, but you are giving it a familiar name, development, and so on. Some of the brothers the other day were consulting me, they want to go to certain country, do da'wah, but they're not allowed to do da'wah in that country, one of the countries. But they said they are allowed economic development kind of projects. I said, this is good. Go build a school, go build a market, go solve the unemployment problem, go try to feed the hungry. No government will tell you no for that. And then when you build a school, you can start to do your da'wah because it's the best da'wah to actually build a school. So my advice is to be realistic. I'm speaking as a lecture in a high ceiling kind of thing. But because I believe that there is a truth that I need to convey to you. But you as a person on the ground, no, do your best and speak to people with what they understand and what they can handle. Not to tell them, capitalism is haram. They tell you, what are you talking about? That's not exactly my objective. But my objective is to make you more critical as you do research. And as a professor, a bit critical so that we can improve, inshallah.
Just to take a few questions online. I think once you talked about earlier, you did mention a few things about Islamic banking contract, Islamic financing contract, murabaha, mudaraba, all of that. So there are quite a bit of questions relevant to that. I'll just pose it as one question. It all revolves around when you have, I think there's the Sharia compliant part, and then there is the Maqasid part. So some questions talk about what if there is a contract that is, of course, halal, so it is Sharia compliant, ticked as Sharia compliant, but not necessarily aligns with the Maqasid of Sharia. How do you approach products that are practiced within that? So it is Sharia compliant, but it's not compliant with Sharia.
Yeah. Well, I would say do your best. I think that the Islamic finances projects that started with the 70s with Islamic Bank of Dubai, obviously, and then the Faisal Bank and etc. The story you would know better than I do. I think has been very useful for Islam, for the cause of Islam, and especially for the Islamic movements, if I may say, for the projects, the movement in not necessarily in the political sense, in the wider sense. The Islamic finances projects have been very helpful for Islamic universities and Islamic schools and Islamic arts and Islamic anything that you can think about has been depending on the revenues that were created by the Islamic finances. And it is still the case to a great extent from what I've seen that a lot of the Islamic projects today are still depending on the charity of Muslims, and Muslims do not get that rich unless they do Islamic finances. Or maybe they are Muslim, but they are not practicing Islam. They will not care anyway. I'm not talking about that category of people. I'm talking about the people who care to give money to a mosque or a school or give a charity. So Islamic finances has been very useful, but I think it's about time that we decrease the amount of murabaha as much as we can and increase the amount of mudaraba and qirad. Because it's about time that the industry does not follow the trend of the capitalist systems as they push the money upwards too much. Because I think that in the general global picture, I believe that Islam has a major role to play in the next stage, especially with the disintegration of, if I may call it, the Western Empire. And therefore, Islam cannot survive like that, just with a purely capitalist economic system. And therefore, I think we need to decrease. Murabaha itself, to me, is a hila, is a halal hila, but it's a hila at the end. You buy a car for 100, you give the bank, you give a bank 120 in checks, and the bank will take the car and put it in the garage, and then from the other door this is a hila by definition. This is not, if you don't think it's a hila, then you go study Ibn al-Qayyim or go study any of the Fuqaha al-Shatibi who talked about hiyal. But so hila could be halal. وخذ بيدك ضغثا فاضرب به ولا تحنث. Sayyidina Ayub, and he made a hila. Hila has an asl in the Quran. But hila is for the darura. Hila is not for the luxury times. That's not how hila becomes halal. Hila is halal in the darura. So if I may answer all of these questions, I think that we need to try to write policies and execute policies that decrease the amount of murabaha that we do in our Islamic institutions and increase the amount of qirad and mudaraba, because yes, it is not a charity, but at least let's make it tijara. Let's make it tijara, if not sadaqah. You don't have to do sadaqah, but at least do tijara. Allah.
Thank you so much. There's someone asking about your book, which is Re-envisioning Islamic Scholarship, and they asked if they can get the ebook version of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I send it to you, inshallah. I can send it to the participants.
Inshallah.
Or I think I have a contact page on my website. Do a contact. It will eventually come. I'll send you the book. I don't have copyrights on it or anything. Right. I don't have copyrights on any of my books, by the way. Yeah. No problem.
Thank you so much. All right. One more question online before we pass it back to the floor. A quick one. From a Maqasid perspective, is earning comes first or spending comes first?
Spending.
I would say earning or saving maybe comes first, or spending comes first.
Spending. Well, it actually depends. Subhanallah, it depends on how much, if I may say, Iman you have. It really depends. And it depends on the stage of your life and what you're trying to do. And Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Sayyidina Abu Bakr brought all his money to Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And he told them, what did you leave for your children? He said, Taraktu Allah wa Rasulah. I left Allah and His Messenger for them. Sayyidina Umar could not do the whole wealth, but he did half of it. So he brought half of it. And Sayyidina Uthman brought like the whole army, he said. And they lived well and they died well. But they are really at a high level of Iman. So if you have that, and I'm not at that level, so I'm advising you for something that I don't have, put all your wealth for the sake of Allah. And the laws of Islam says that you will be fine. You will be fine. Donate everything and you will be fine. If you have that level of Iman and you want to try it. But always realistically, which is perhaps what I do in my personal life, I try to balance between your needs and your spending. So spend in the way of Allah, not just your zakah. Zakah is not your right. Zakah is the poor's right. But on top of zakah, you have to give a little bit. And balance what you need and your family, different stages. When you are a retired person and you just need to eat, that's different from when you have 5 kids growing in schools. That's different, and so on. So just balance, please. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the ultimate wisdom. وَلَا تَجْعَلْ يَدَكَ مَغْلُولَةً إِلَىٰ عُنُقِكَ وَلَا تَبْسُطْهَا كُلَّ الْبَسْطِ فَتَقْعُدَ مَلُومًا مَحْسُورًا. Don't be greedy 100% and don't give 100%. And therefore you sit and you try to find someone to give you a loan. No, don't go there. But try to make sure that you balance, inshallah. Allah alam.
Jazakallah khair. All right, we'll pass it back to the floor. Questions?
Bismillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Thank you very much, Dr. Jasser, for the beneficial sharing. I'm Abdurrahman. My question is perhaps more general regarding Maqasid Sharia in Islamic finance specifically. So from the perspective of yourself as a scholar and researcher in Maqasid in general, not necessarily Maqasid in Islamic finance as a specialization, what is your observation on the perhaps the gaps or the probably missteps in the implementation of Maqasid Sharia in Islamic finance project? Because we have observed the rising application or implementation awareness surrounding Maqasid Sharia, not only at, for example, Malaysia, but also globally from the international fatwa bodies, etc. So perhaps from your observation as a researcher in Maqasid Sharia, what are some of the gaps or missteps in us implementing Maqasid Sharia? Thank you.
Barakallahu feekum. My advice is to differentiate between the genuine Maqasid approaches and the disgenuine Maqasid approaches. Sometimes Maqasid Sharia is used as a repelling of public opinion pressure on authorities, whatever the authorities are, political, economic, cultural. So people with authority, they feel the pressure of the masses on their authority, and therefore they reply with Maqasid Sharia empty talk. It's the same good old tyranny of Fir'aun and Qarun and Haman, but then people are talking about Maqasid Sharia. Our state is compliant with Hifd al-Din wal-Nafs wal-Aql wal-Mal. And if you look at the state with the Quranic lens, it is the Pharaonic state of Fir'aun and Qarun and Haman. Totally, with everything in it. But people are using Maqasid Sharia in a disgenuine way. Versus people who are honest about trying to achieve the maqasid in the society. So my advice is to differentiate between Maqasid Al-Shariah as a repelling, as a discourse for apologizing for a wrong status quo, versus Maqasid Al-Shariah as a discourse to improve that status quo. How do you measure the status quo? Well, Islam, everybody knows Islam. Everybody knows justice versus injustice, rights versus non-rights. You know, so if Maqasid Al-Shariah is used to justify, I don't know, I heard recently, like in the political talk of the Arab world, normalization with Israel. But from the Maqasid Al-Shariah perspective, what is that? Like how do you justify that, for God's sake? You know, that's not Maqasid Al-Shariah, that's Maqasid Al-Shaitan. You see, you know, like how come? You know, I understand, you know, wars and peace and politics, yeah, this is very complex and so on. But don't tell me that Maqasid Al-Shariah is allowing a normalization with an enemy who's actually slaughtering Muslims, innocent. You know, maybe slaughtering people in a war is fine, just war, men to men. But this is not men to men. This is men to children and women and buildings and hospitals. And you're saying that this is compliant with Maqasid Al-Shariah. What is that? You see, so just to give you one example of what I hear sometimes, and as someone, as you mentioned, as a student of Maqasid Sharia science, I get very frustrated with that. When I hear someone who is using Maqasid Sharia for Ribba or zina. You know, I sat once in the city of London for a lecture, and they brought a Muslim guy who is saying that because of Maqasid Sharia, a family could be 2 men or 2 women, or like I actually stood up. I said, no, I'm sorry. Maqasid Sharia has nothing to do with what we call in Islam fahisha or zina or adultery. There is a definition of adultery. You have freedom, you allow things by law. I was in the UK, again, the city of London. I said, you allow things by law, that is fine. But you don't say that this is Islam. This is not Islam. And Maqasid al-Sharia, the higher objectives of Islam, are not supposed to contradict the Sharia itself. So they use Maqasid al-Sharia to justify zina, or use Maqasid al-Sharia to justify occupation of Muslim lands and killing people and driving them out of their homes. No, that is not Maqasid al-Sharia. So be careful with that. Otherwise, inshallah, it's good to do research, inshallah.
Assalamu alaikum, Prof. So my question is kind of related to one of the questions that was already asked about the difference between Sharia compliance and quote-unquote Maqasid compliance. So do you see Sharia compliance and Maqasid compliance as 2 distinct stages? As like, for example, first you reach Sharia compliance and then you add something to make it Maqasid compliant? Or should the Maqasid already be kind of inherent within Sharia compliance? And I'm asking, like, from the perspective of how the Maqasid were developed in the first place as more descriptive of the already existing rulings on halal and haram rather than prescriptive.
Yeah, well, I think we need to differentiate between Sharia and fiqh. Sharia is the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. شرع يشرع شارع يعني شرع لكم من الدين ما وصى به ثم جعلناك على شريعة. That's different from fiqh. Fiqh is the understanding of the Sharia. And the understanding of the Sharia is human, is not Sharia. Fiqh is not Sharia. It's like kalam is not aqidah. Kalam, mu'tazila, asha'ira, maturidiyya. That's not aqidah, that's kalam. Aqidah is different. Aqidah is to believe in Allah and the hereafter. Sharia is not fiqh. And fiqh is not equal to the history of fiqh. Fiqh is the application of the Quran and Sunnah to the reality. And yes, it could be according to a certain madhab. You could be Shafi'i, you could be Hanafi. And you apply the Hanafi usul on the current reality. That is Hanafi fiqh. But that's different from going back in history and quoting Abu Hanifa or Shafi'i, Abu Hanifa or Abu Yusuf or Sarakhsi or like the Ahnaf. You know, that is different. So it is important that the Sharia compatibility, we understand it as fiqh compatibility, not Sharia. because the word Sharia is big. It's Aqidah. That's not Aqidah, that's Kalam, you see. So Sharia is not fiqh. And in the fiqh compatibility, it is very important to do contemporary fiqh, not to copy from the past. Why do you have these gaps between fiqh, between Sharia compliance and Maqasid compliance? Is that because Sharia compliance is defined according to the books of the past. And the Maqasid compliance will bring the contemporary looks, the contemporary present, justice or something. And yes, I agree with you that they both have to be one and the same. They have to be fiqh. And fiqh is not separate from its maqasid, from the higher objectives. And it doesn't mean that you don't learn from the books of the past. You learn. But when you sit down and do fiqh, you are not supposed to copy from the books of the past. That is not fiqh. That is history. And obviously that is in the variable issues. Like, I'm not saying make wudu in a different way or do hajj or umrah. No, the thawabit or the fixed parts of Islam are fixed from the beginning. And you make wudu Shafi'i or Hanafi or Ja'fari, that is all fine. That is all fine and correct. But I'm talking to sit down today and think about Islamic finances, for example. A new stock market kind of instrument that they brought up. You cannot judge that based on the books of the past, because they did not have the same thing. You have to have a new fiqh. And that's when the Maqasid compatibility is different from the Sharia compliance. The Sharia compliance becomes a way of what we call in fiqh, takyif al-fiqhi. Takyif is to look at the new issue and find the closest issue from the past that is similar to the new issue. To me, this is wrong usul. This is not the right usul. The right usul is to go by the usul. If you are Shafi'i, fine. Quran and Sunnah and Ijma' and Qiyas, according to the definitions of Shafi'iyya, fine. But apply that to the current situation. Don't go to the past and look for something similar, because there is nothing similar to what we have today. These are new instruments and new, I was the other day in a North American Fiqh Council, they were discussing transplantation. And some of the brothers are actually saying that transplantation is halal because the Shafi'iyya allowed a golden tooth, and the Ahnaf allowed a silver nose. No, but to put a piece of silver for your nose, that's not like heart transplantation or kidney or face transplantation. Now we have very, very complex questions. You cannot say you can transplant a face because the Shafi'iyya allowed a fake tooth or a fake nose. That's different. So that's the difference between copying from the past and doing fiqh for today. If you transplant a face, what is the maslaha and what is the mafsada? What is the dalil? How can you deal with this? What are the psychological issues? Where do you get the face from? From a prison in one of the Arab countries? Or you're gonna, how do you do these things? You see, these are very important issues so that we are guided, inshallah.
Bismillah. My name is Muhammad Falah. So to make it very brief, you mentioned about the istihdath min al-adam. So do you have any view on any Sharia compliant, quote unquote, or Sharia optimal form or way of money?
Sharia compliant versus, I'm sorry, I didn't get the question.
Yes, so some Muslim economists or thinkers advocate for, biometric standards, some advocate for Bitcoin, some for crypto-based, to move away from fiat, which they are considered to be non-compliant. Yes, so do you have any view on that?
Well, the crypto world, as I said in the lecture, I really don't understand. So in order to give you a judgment. But I do think that breaking the monopoly over currencies is a good thing. Just very, very general. From my just general background, you understand the economic equations better than I do. But I think that it's about time that we break this cycle of the monopoly over the value of currencies, and especially the dollar. I think it's very important to break that cycle. And this is going to be very tough. This is not just a small war. This is going to be a major war to do that. But I think it's for the best, because there is a lot of injustice that happened because of that tying to the dollar kind of business. استحداث المال من العدم, yes, it is a problem. Is a problem that you write or print a colored paper that is technically in Islam is a sak. Sak. And sak, we know the sak, is to say, if you take this, give him $1 golden, $1 golden dinar, or a cow, or a whatever, sak. And then we trade in the sak. And then I put a sak in my pocket, and the next morning the sak is down 10%. No, this is not right from the Islamic point of view. So that's the view I offered. Do I have alternatives? No, I don't. I think that there are people who are trying to offer alternatives, trying to minimize interest, trying for the Islamic banks not to deal with the cycle of generating money, or to decrease that as much as possible. I'm aware of an attempt in Qatar, for example, trying to decrease so that the Islamic bank, yes, it's still creating money, but it's creating less money than the conventional bank, at least. So we improve. Al-Islah. إن أريد إلا الإصلاح ما استطعت. I try to reform as much as I can, but to know the truth as well, inshallah. Barakallahu fi.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Jasser. I think this was a very beneficial session. And Jazakallah khair, may your work be in Mizan Hasanatik, inshallah. And may Allah, Jazakallah khair.